This is the oral history interview of Mary Tochiko Oi, that's O-I, conducted by David Kuroda. This occurs at her office at 2730 Wilshire Boulevard, Santa Monica, California. Today's date is January the 16th, 2002. You know, these interviews are going to be stored in the... There actually is a website for the California Social Welfare Archives, and people who want to find out about, say, what it was like for a social worker in the concentration camps will be able to go to the website and gain access to the interviews. So whatever you talk about will be available to researchers and people who are curious about what was going on in the country at that time. Mm-hmm. So whatever you say can be heard by many different people. It'll be transcribed, and those documents will be available to researchers and students who want to know more about social welfare policy and what was going on at that time. Mm-hmm. Let me introduce the interview today. This is Mary Oi. We're in her office in Santa Monica, California. And this is a continuation of an interview. Mary has been a social worker for many years. Maybe first let me ask you, Mary, how did you get into the field of social welfare? Tell us about that and how your interest in social work developed.
Well, I was thinking about this. I think I had no idea about what social work was, actually. And when I entered college, I was not sure what I wanted to do. I knew that I was not going to be a teacher. And I felt part of the teaching thing was too broad for me. That I wanted to know what happened to this person, an individual person, and sort of see how they developed. Whereas in teaching, that happens, certainly, but it's such a group situation, and I felt I wasn't very good with these groups. So anyway, I decided I didn't want to teach, so I was just a liberal arts major. And I majored in sociology. And then, at the time I entered college, that was before the war. So
you talked about the war, that's World War II.
Yes.
And we don't hear that too often, you know, when people talk about before the war. But I used to hear that a lot with my parents.
Mm-hmm. Because that was sort of a marking point. Mm-hmm. But I was in college for a year and a half before the war. So I really didn't get into much of anything, and I was just taking those required courses. But prior to that in high school, I had a course called Senior Problems, and it was a new course, and we just talked about problems people had, and that this was an area of some interest to me, so that stuck with me. And this goes even further back, when I was like in 10th grade. Do you remember when Roosevelt established those work programs for people out of work? What do they call that?
WPA? I don't remember. I read
like the
about
WPA
that.
and the artists, they were given work, and they did a lot of things like that. They had something for children, for youth, and it was called, I think it was NYA, National Youth. And I got a job with them one year, and I would go after school to an outpatient clinic.
This is as a 10th grader?
No, 10th, 11th, something like that.
So you were pretty young at the time.
Mm-hmm. And I was sort of interviewing people who came. taking data and then referring them to the doctors who were there. And mostly they were given physicals, so they could do work like I was doing all over the city. That was interesting. So I got into interviewing. And then in the camps, I started by being a clothing allowance person who interviewed everyone in the camps.
Now these camps were the relocation centers or concentration camps for the Japanese?
Yes, it was the camp in Colorado. Not the assembly center, which was Santa Anita. In Santa Anita, I worked as a preschool teaching assistant. I hated it. It was too noisy, there was no control, and I felt I was doing very little. And I would take the kids around the racetrack for a walk. That was about it. But the most interesting part of that, to me, was we had parent-teacher conferences of sorts. The parents would come, and they would, sort of defer to me as the teacher.
Well, there's a lot of respect for teachers.
Yes, and they would bow down to me, including. And I just felt so guilty about that because I wasn't doing anything. Anyway, so in the camp.
These were the assembly center before the Japanese were shipped off to camps.
To the inner camps.
So this was at the Santa Anita racetrack?
Yes.
And then when you were in camp in Colorado, was it Amachi? You started talking about how you began to do some work there. That was like social work in camps.
Yeah, because I started with the clothing allowance, registering everyone, how many in the family and so forth. And from that, they asked me if I would be what they call a social case aide. And so that's what I did.
And what did you do as a social case aide?
I was a social worker.
And what kinds of problems did you help people with? And this is what year, 1940 what?
It was 1942 to about 44. Something like that.
So this is right around the time World War II was going on, right after?
It was right during the war. But I think in our camp, we had a very good social welfare department. And they tried to make it run very professionally. And we had an MSW trained director who got an MSW teacher of social work from Denver who moved into that area so she could be our case supervisor. So she had seminars and things like that every week. And of course, I was included in all this. So I learned a lot.
Now, Mary, how did you get involved in the social work or the social casework program at camp?
Because I worked doing clothing allowances, registering people. And that was done, I think, in the social welfare department. So from there, I got to know the people there. And
well, this is very fascinating because even in Harry Kitano's book on Japanese Americans, there is very little mention of the social work program in the camps. What kinds of problems did you as a social worker help people deal with?
Well, I didn't deal with this directly, but there were lots of cases where the families were split, like parts of the family were in one camp and some were in another, and attempts were made to get them transferred so they'd be together. That kind of problem. We also did really foster care in a sense.
And children whose parents weren't there?
They were not there for various reasons, like illness, and they may have been left behind in California because they were in a sanitarium or something like that. And the children, I think there was a place, one camp that had them, like Manzanar, but I'm not sure of that. But then, relatives would do that. We had one case that I worked on where this older woman had this young baby, actually, and I can't recall how she came to have the baby, but she said she couldn't take care of this child anymore. So she asked that we do something, remove the child. So we did, and at that time we had just hired a medical social worker with an MSW from Western Reserve. This is a non-Japanese person. And she came to the camp, and she was supposed to be a medical social worker. So she went with me to remove this child. And prior to that, I had talked with this lady as best I could. And then she said, she was ready to give this child up. So we went to pick up this child, and the woman she couldn't get the child out. She started, she was having a real hard time with it. And she was crying and so forth, and she was handing the child over to me, and then she would hit me. Not hard, but The social worker from Western Reserve hit her back.
Wow.
And I explained to her, the social worker, that this woman is going through a lot of trauma right now, and this is her way of trying to... I had to explain it to her.
Was this woman able to speak English, or did she speak Japanese?
She was not Japanese. Oh, the client?
The client, the older woman.
She was Japanese, older Japanese. She must have been like...
English, or did she speak
No,
Japanese?
she spoke Japanese.
And you spoke and understood Japanese?
Simple Japanese. But anyway, these are cultural kinds of issues, but they transcend all races. But this social worker was amazing to me that she didn't understand this. And here I was trying to explain. But we did get the child out of there. And then, we had to wait for a permanent foster care. So our director took that child home, to his own home, which I think at that time was located outside the camp.
So the social work director took the child home to his own residence?
Until plans could be made more permanently, because we were waiting for transportation problems and things like that. But another interesting case I had was an older woman who had come from Central California on a farm, and she had a lot of kids. Some of them were married, and she had grandchildren. This woman was old, and she really looked old, like toothless old. Anyway, she then said that she was pregnant.
How old do you think she might have been?
Well, her daughter was probably 30-something. She was old, and her husband was old.
50, 60?
And they were transient farm workers.
And she was pregnant at 50 or 60?
I think she looked like she was 60 maybe. Anyway, so she went to the doctor, and I said, you need to go to the doctor and so forth, and she did get prenatal care. And the doctor said, yes, she was pregnant. You know, that woman, in the middle of a big snowstorm, delivered that baby. She walked from her barracks to the hospital and said, I'm delivering. And She got there, and there's no baby.
There was no baby?
Mm-mm.
What happened?
It was what they call a pseudocyesis. I learned about this. It's a false pregnancy. It's a psychological kind of problem. And I felt, later on that, her big role in life was to have babies. And she just didn't have a small child anymore. It was sort of sad. And after that, I went to see her, and she acted like nothing happened.
Then had you become her counselor after that?
No, not as... I would go and see her, but I didn't do anything, actually. But, her whole family was so involved, too. But it was amazing.
Mary, how do you suppose your camp experiences affected your career later on?
Well, I got into social work.
So it was because of that experience in helping people that you decided to get a graduate education?
Well, I went and finished college. But when I left the camp during the war, I was 19, I think it was 44, something like that. I went to Washington, D.C., and I left camp having secured a job as a typist clerk at the OPA, which is the Office of Press Administration. And that was all I was qualified to do. So I went there and I looked at the place. It covered a whole block of nothing but typists sitting in rows. And I thought to myself, gee, I really don't want to do this. But, I had no choice. But then, before I started the job, I got a telegram saying they would not hire me.
Why wouldn't they hire you?
Because they said I was still considered suspect.
Because you were Japanese?
Well, I left the camp and they gave me clearance. But they said that my father was interned, separately from us, and therefore I was also suspect. And so I asked for a hearing, and eventually they cleared me, they said. But
Well, it's very good that you asked for a hearing, because many of the Japanese at the time would have just walked away and not questioned that decision. So you asked for a hearing, huh?
Oh yeah, and I got a hearing. It was quite an experience. And at the end, I got so angry that I said, even if you cleared me, I wouldn't work for you for anything. Because they started asking me about religion. It was ridiculous. And I said, this is against the Constitution. You should never ask me what my religion is and things like that. And why didn't I become this religion rather than this religion? Things like that.
So they were asking you some pretty personal and really questions that were not directly related to the work that you were being hired to do.
My brother had just graduated from college. And I think a week after graduation, he went into the Army, the U.S. Army. And they said, why didn't he go in earlier? And I said, he was going to be drafted, and he wanted to wait till that was his graduation, which was only a few weeks or so. And they were saying, well, he should have, just volunteered. Now, remember when they didn't want Japanese men in the Army?
That's right.
And now they're saying, why didn't he, and so forth. Anyway, they were saying things like that, which by the end of this hearing made me so angry. So, therefore, I was without a job. And I went to the employment service, and I worked for a Catholic organization, and they were doing work with, what do they call that organization? Catholic, taking care of soldiers who were on leave, things like that. And it was a clerical job. I didn't stay with that very long. I didn't like it. And then I went back to the employment service and I got another job, and this time it was with a social welfare agency. And it was called they were doing foster daycare and counseling. And the foster daycare was a fairly new program, and it was for daycare of working mothers. And in Washington at that wartime, a lot of the mothers worked. So they needed daycare, and I think it was a fairly new kind of thing. The agency developed foster daycare homes, supervised them, did all the work with the mother and the foster mothers. So I went to work there.
And then when did you go to graduate school?
When I returned to California, and when the war ended, I came back, went back to UCLA, finished my undergrad in sociology, and I think as an undergrad I worked for a sociology professor, and we did evacuation claims research, and he published a book on it.
Well, Mary, I think you probably were one of the very first Japanese-American social workers in this country, weren't you? Do you know anybody that was a social worker before you?
Yes. In the camps, there were two women who were from Northern California, and I think they both had MSWs, or MAs, or whatever they call them. And one was from Berkeley Social Work School, and the other one went to Mills College. Maybe they both did. But they were social workers.
They had their MSWs?
I don't think they were called MSWs then. They both had MAs. And I think they were both supervisors in our department. And I know the one lady, her name was Yuri. She went to New York, and I think she had a lot of records of what went on in the camps. And I don't know who has those records, but it would really be interesting.
Mary, how did your experiences with the prejudice, the camp experience, affect how you then later on in your social work career handled things and set up programs?
How did I handle?
I guess the question is how your experiences with prejudice, with being not hired for a job because you were Japanese American, the camp experience, all of those must have had an effect on you and your later career as a professional social worker. What do you suppose that effect or those effects were?
Well, I think that people in social work, generally, I don't know about now, there were people who I thought had the right kinds of values. So the agencies that I worked in, like the one in Washington, was very therapeutic for me. It counteracted the other things. And the other agencies I've worked in, I've always had that experience of, having much more acceptance. Now, the prejudice part of it, I don't know how that, I'm much more aware of it, of people being prejudiced against, and more sensitive to that, in clients.
Now, as an administrator, because you later on worked in a number of different agencies, did that sensitivity to prejudice, even for other people, contribute to how you handle issues and how you handled staff problems?
Well, yeah, but I don't think I was quite aware of it. And so when I'm in a position of hiring people, I wouldn't hire anyone who I thought was prejudiced that much, if you know what I mean. So the kinds of people I worked with were not prejudiced people on the whole. Now, we did at one point, I remember this now, at one time we were having students, psychology students, from a psychology school connected with a religious seminary. And one of those interns, when she was interviewing, she was finished the interview, she was a nice person, probably quite good, but she would end the interview by putting her hand over the client's head and praying. I felt this was totally inappropriate because we were not a religious agency. So I talked to her about it, and she said she didn't think it was harmful. And so I asked her to stop it, because I said I thought the client would not be in favor of it if they were not of her religion. But things like that, you know.
Mary, of all the things you've done in your professional career, what are some of the things that you're the most proud of?
Proud of? Well, I don't know. I think I'm the most proud of having helped a lot of people, hopefully, where they could go on and, lead more productive lives. Whether that's done through an agency or privately. And that's very rewarding.
So you really like the individual, the clinical work that you had with so many people you work with. How about policy issues or organizational issues? Because you've worked with a number of different agencies, including the Frosted School.
And I worked for the county welfare for quite a while.
Are there programs or policies that you help institute that you take some pride in?
Well, I think when I worked at the Frosted School, I was their first full-time social worker. And my job was to set up the clinical department. So I did that. And that was okay, but it wasn't something that I was crazy about doing. It was sort of put upon me to do this.
But you did it.
I did it.
You were the first social worker there at the Frosted School, and today there's apparently a whole service there, right?
Yeah, there's a whole diagnostic service, there's a whole clinical program. We instituted therapy for the children, parent counseling, family work, things like that.
Now, were those some of the things that you initiated?
And we had consultants. We had interns from, as I said, from some of these religious places, but these were psychology interns. Prior to that, the other thing too at the Frosted School was sort of learning a lot about children with organic disabilities and trying to tease out what was emotional and what was more organic, and how to remediate some of that. And Dr. Foster was very good at that. So I learned a lot from that. Prior to that, I worked at the Pasadena Child Guidance Clinic.
That's right.
And
What did you do?
that was my first job after my MSW, because I was placed there, as a second-year student. And then when I left, they hired me. So I worked there for 7 years. And did students. I had started working on social work students from SC.
So you were a supervisor there at the Child Guidance Clinic in Pasadena for how many years?
I was a student supervisor.
Student supervisor.
We only had a few social workers. It was a very small clinic. The director was a social worker, and I think there were 2 other social workers. And then they hired me. So I was like... So it was a small place. Now it's changed its name and it's incorporated.
What's the name now?
It was part of that Pasadena, that big thing. I don't know what they call it. It's no longer exists.
So you had a number of students then that you helped train?
No, not a number. I had 2 students, because they only had 2 always. I had 2 students, finished that year, and started the second batch, and then I had to have emergency surgery, so I couldn't do them. And then after that, I think I must have left.
You were at the Foster School for over, 20, 25 years?
Something like that. And they moved from place to place and so forth. And different programs started. We had different directors.
How would you say the social political climate of the country during your career, how would you say that is different than now? How would you compare the two? Because you were starting to practice as a social worker right after the World War II ended. There was probably a lot of prejudice against Asians, particularly Japanese Americans. What was it like for you to be a professional social worker during that time?
Well, time goes on, and I think people forget about the prejudices of the wartime. But I don't think I've ever had an experience where a client would refuse to see me because of my ethnic background. They would ask questions about what I was, and I would tell them.
But no client ever walked out after you told them you were Japanese American?
No, I don't think they ever did. I used to do work with children, and some of the kids would ask me a lot of questions because of the movies and so forth. And when I would tell them that I was, Japanese background, they would say, but you don't look like that because you don't speak like they do. And they would, mimic all the stereotypes you see, the appearance, with their eyes, things like that. But no, I don't think I've ever experienced it that much. I had wondered about it in terms of starting private practice. But I started private practice part-time when I was still with the Pasadena Child Guidance Clinic. I worked with a psychiatrist, and then at Frosted, later on, I started private practice. So it just sort of continued.
Were there additional concerns about your private practice because of your orphan background?
You mean from clients?
Uh-huh.
No, because they knew who I was. And most of the people I've seen have been referrals from other clients. So they knew who I was. Interesting.
I sometimes get a startled look when clients see me for the first time, because over the phone they can't tell what my ethnicity is. And I think when people refer to me, they don't say, oh, this Japanese American mediator or social worker. So often
Don't they ask about your name?
Some people do, but most don't.
Well, my name is so unusual. When I first started, long ago, they would always say, oy vey. And, then they would say, well, and I would explain what I was. And then some would say, are you French? Because it's like we. So, we would talk about it and laugh about it and so on, but I never had real trouble with it.
One of the things we wanted to ask about would be the most satisfying part of your professional career. You kind of touched on that. And also, what for you was some of the most difficult parts of your career as a social worker?
What was the most satisfying? Well, I think, as I said before, it was this direct contact with the clients and trying to understand them, which is always, to me, very, very interesting. And people say to me from way back, don't you get tired of listening to people's problems? Well, I have to say I don't, because everyone is so different. And the way they evolve and the way they present themselves, to me it's very interesting. And I like working with adolescents because they really are interesting.
Well, that's a credit to you and to your spirit, because you're almost 80 years old now.
I know.
And to still really enjoy hearing the stories and to never tire of all the stories that people bring. That's pretty amazing.
Yes, and some of the things that, I've done or thought of, they've come about. In the old days, they used to say that children with learning disabilities or hyperactivity, that kind of thing, it was emotional. Remember that? Autistic children was poor parenting. And they would go through...
I remember the thinking about that.
Oh, yeah.
In those days.
And I've always thought that was baloney. And
So
I would say that to the parent. I said, it's not that at all. You can get into poor parenting, but it's not because of poor parenting that you have this child with brain damage of some sort, But in some places, that's what they were led to believe. And they would be treated with psychotherapy, period, And then they got into behavior mod. And that in itself, I don't think is the answer either.
So you were one of the first in the field that recognized there were actual problems in the brain for some of these children that interfered with their learning, affected their emotions. How about challenges, problems that you encountered in your career?
Well, I don't think I'm very good at dealing with like large administrative edicts that come along. And when I worked for the welfare department, I was doing child welfare. And I really thought that was such a great experience. I think any social worker starting out should do that, should work in the welfare department, at least for a while, because you really get this background experience that you wouldn't get elsewhere. But when I started supervising child welfare, and, you know, running a unit like that, you would get these things from Sacramento that said, the law has changed now to this and this and this. I couldn't take that. I just felt, I don't want to do this, because then you have to deal with all your workers and deal with their frustration and all their anger. I just set this up and now they're saying we've got to do otherwise, and over and over, so I quit.
So the bureaucratic changes that came down from Sacramento were pretty difficult for you.
And that kind of big organization things, I don't like that. And I usually will avoid it. It's not satisfying.
Do you suppose that affected how you then work in the remainder of your career at the Frosted?
Well, I worked mostly in private practice.
Oh,
You know, you don't have to have that, except with insurances now. So I avoid insurances if I can. I try not to do that.
Anything, Mary, that you would do differently if you had to do it all over again? Any regrets or any changes you would have made in how you made decisions in your life?
Well, one thing is that if you're in private practice alone, it's a very lonely place. If social agencies still operated like they used to, I don't know how they really operate, but I think that would be a better place to work, because you get input from other staff people, you learn more. So in a sense, I think working in a good social agency probably would have been more interesting from the point of view of co-workers, friendships, that kind of thing.
So you might have enjoyed getting involved in a good agency where you could have combined the clinical experience along with the being able to be with colleagues.
Yeah, and setting up new programs and things like that, you know, which...
Although you did that at the Prostate Center. Now, what main changes have you observed in the field of social work from the early days in your career, contrasting that with today?
I think social work as a profession, I hate to say this, I think it's gone downhill.
Why do you suppose that's happened?
I think the value put upon private practice of serving middle class and upper class financially.
Do you think that's hurt the profession? That the value of serving the middle and upper classes has hurt the profession?
I think it's hurt the profession in the sense of serving people with less. There's not enough attention paid to helping the poor or the people who aren't able to function. and it's kind of understandable, and in a way it's not.
So that's one of the big differences, that social work when you were in the profession in your early years seemed to be more committed to meeting the needs of the poor.
And the value put upon that professionally was, there was a high value put upon that, I thought. And I think people were pretty committed to that. But I do think that the bureaucratic things and all these changes that came from above kind of took away all that importance.
You know, there are also huge changes in our country too, because with welfare reform and the...
Yeah, look at welfare reform. It's pretty bad.
So we care less about the poor in this country than those that have money.
Yeah, it's become so political. And some of the people who are in political positions to establish that kind of policy, I just don't agree with some of that.
See, one of the problems on there is that
and like
mental
health, it's pathetic.
What do you mean?
Well, when I was in social work school and later, we had agencies that dealt with people coming out of state hospitals and following them, helping them get jobs, helping them get settled and so forth, and had ongoing therapy, casework help for them.
What years are we talking about?
We're talking about like when did I get out of SC? 57? I'm talking about the 50s and the 60s. And then everything shut down. State hospital shut. And the homeless population expanded.
Why do you suppose that happened?
Because they're mentally ill.
Well, I mean, why were there changes in the mental health system? Why were the state hospitals shut down?
Well, they were shut down, I think, because it was during that time when civil rights, freedom, that kind of thing was a big issue. And I think if you were in a state hospital, it was like, well, you're depriving them of their civil rights. That was one aspect. And the other one was it's too expensive. They could be taken care of in the community, but they didn't set up good enough programs in the community at all. And
are you referring to some of the changes because of the Landerman-Petrie-Short Act?
And later. But I think that pretty soon it got so that if you were working with that population, it was so unrewarding. You know, you couldn't follow it. Things kept changing constantly. And I just think, I hope it picks up again.
So the reduction in services and the closure of the state hospitals, you think, came about partly because of concerns about the
It was a
rights of
political,
patients?
well, that was one part.
How about politicians' priorities?
But the politicians would use these things in order to do what they wanted to do. So it's really sad. What was your other question? It had to do with...
I think how the profession has changed over the years. And one of the points you made was that I think earlier on, certainly in the 50s and 60s, the profession seemed to care more about the poor.
The other thing too, though, is the population, I think dealing with the poor then, it was more, you could contain it better and think about it in a more contained way. But then with more influx of people coming in from all over the world, it just got so unwieldy that no one knew what to do. That's the way I feel. And it just got so unsatisfying as a profession. Now, I'm sure a lot of people would disagree with me, but that's how, if I were starting out again, I don't know where I would work or what I would want to do.
See, one of the challenges, I think, of government and our profession is that some of the very best people who know about human needs and families are the very same people that have such a strong distaste for bureaucracy and organizations and politics.
I know.
So, whereas you could have been, had you been a politician or a director of a social welfare agency, so you chose to spend your time in a private agency and a private practice, which for you was much more satisfying. I have similar conflicts too, because I think on one hand, I would like to be at a level where I can influence policy.
Okay, but see, you can do that if you had a source of income that would support your ability to do that. Now, if you went to Sacramento or Washington and became a lobbyist and that kind of thing, that's all fine. But where are you going to get supported? I mean, there should be an agency for it, to do that, because you have to think about making a living.
Unless, of course, you were a state senator or you were in the legislature already. See, then that gives you a position. But that's been one of the problems. We haven't had a social worker in the White House or in the cabinet position for quite a while.
I know. But there ought to be, you're right, there ought to be something done about that in the schools of social work. To have a major in that. Not how to be a therapist, but how to be someone who works making social policy or affecting. How do you do that nowadays?
I think there are schools like UCLA no longer has a school of social welfare, and their social welfare program is in the School of Public Policy and Research.
Right.
So the challenge is to have some of the people who know about policy get into positions where they can actually change policy.
Well, but then they wouldn't go into social work.
That's right. That's right. What future do you see for the social work profession?
As things are now, well, I feel like it's pretty dismal. Younger people will often ask me, they want to get into becoming therapists. And they go to professional schools like CSP, that type of school. And what is the fastest way to do this and so forth. And I always tell them, go to social work school.
And why do you say that?
Because I think it's better. I think it's easier. It's easier in the sense that you have supervised, you have a supervisor who will supervise you. Whereas the others, you have to go and find your own supervisor and do all that. And sometimes you can't find that. And I think I get the feeling there's no feeling of togetherness, or, they're out there all by themselves. Whereas in social work, I feel like there's more of a bonding to a profession. But I think it doesn't have as high status as being a psychologist, so they choose to go to the other.
Although I will say that more and more, as attorneys and judges know me and know what the LCSW means, I think it confers more status on our profession.
Than the others. Than the other degrees. Yeah, that's true.
Anything else in the last few minutes of our interview that you'd like to say about your life and career in social work, and about what your life has represented?
Well, I must say that I think I'm fortunate because I've been doing the kind of work that I really do enjoy. And when I hear people at retirement ages saying they're so glad to quit working and they're so glad to be out of it and so forth, as if work were such a drudgery, I feel like I'm so lucky because I found something that suits me. And I think this is very important, that people do find things that suit their own personality. So that means knowing yourself and all of that. That's the kind of thing I deal with my teenagers. Are these whole identity things,
And Mary, do you still look forward to coming to work every day?
I don't come every day now. I'm only here 1 or 2 days.
Uh-huh.
And I'm hoping that will go down. I've got to quit sometime. But I haven't taken on new people. So,
But
old people come back. 5 years later, they send their kids back.
Really? So you have clients who 5 years later are calling
20 years later.
20 years
later.
later? Wow.
I ran into a family in a restaurant last week as I was walking out of the restaurant. And they all come running up to me, hugging me, and I said, my God, who are these people? Well, they were my clients from
20 years
that
ago.
girl now is 20, she must be 26. I think I knew her when she was like 7, 8, 10. And at intervals after that.
Well, that's pretty amazing.
The other thing is in terms of memory. I think, my memory is really bad, and it's going. But memory about clients and their families, that has always been one of my strong points. I don't know why that is, but I remember, what position they were in the family, and, what the conflicts were with this one or that one, that kind of thing. It's weird.
Well, that's pretty amazing that your mind can remember all those things. You don't have
about
to
the clients, but not about other things. But it is interesting.
Well, I think it indicates what's important for you, Mary.
But now you're doing mediation. I think social workers probably will go into different fields like that as a professional social worker, and still use that title.
Yeah, at the court, for many years, most of the staff members were professional social workers and had that background, including all of our directors except for the current director.
And now?
Now our current director is a marriage family therapist, background in counseling.
And then the people coming in Are they MFCs too?
More and more MFCCs are now they're called MFTs, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Why is that?
I think as leadership changes, as the director and the managers change, they tend to hire more people from similar backgrounds, and maybe they don't value
The training.
social work training as much. See, that's one of the reasons I think it's important that quality people are in positions of authority and responsibility.
Yeah.
For example, when you were hiring staff, you would not hire people who didn't share.
Similar values,
That's
yeah.
right. That's right. But the dilemma for many people is that the challenges of administration and management are such that they find it unpleasant and distasteful and stressful.
Well, I think what social workers are really better at is really, treating the person in his own cultural environment, in his own family, his own background, so forth, and to really understand that and to accept that. And I think other professions don't dwell on that as much. And it's too bad, I think.
Well, maybe with the expansion of more diverse clients in certain California, the opportunities for that social work perspective will be greater.
You have to laugh though, because right now with the war going on, and they took those people into Cuba, and there's a big controversy that their housing and their care is not up to par. And then our Attorney General says it's their culture. They're used to that kind of cultural thing. He uses that word to mean that they don't need good shelter. It's okay because they're used to that. That's been their culture. So it's used negatively, in my opinion. And then in the paper they had this big divorce case of this billionaire whose wife is divorcing him.
Victoria.
Yeah. Anyway, I could see, someone coming up with this wife is trying to, keep this child within her own culture. So they're using this word, negatively and positive. They're just throwing it around, so it's going to be a big word. It already is.
It sort of cheapens the concept of culture if we equate that with lifestyle.
Yes. Okay.
Well, Mary, we appreciate very much your willingness to be interviewed and to have your comments on tape.
Well, I hope someone will use it someday.
I think so. It's been helpful for me to know what the camp experience was like for you, to know what situations my parents were in, because they were in the same camp as you, to hear about how your work with the clothing allocations developed into a person who became a professional social worker. And you've been in the field now for 40 years? Longer?
Longer. About 50, isn't it?
So you had a career of over 50 years in social work. You
I
have a
think.
very low number for your license. So you got licensed in 19...
I was, what do they call that? Grandfathered in or something?
Oh, really?
I think, yeah.
Also, after the LCSW came into effect in California, you were grandfather or grandmother in.
Isn't that the word they used? I think.
They used to use that. I'm not sure if we would say grandparents or grandmothers or something, but yes. So So when did you then first get your license as a clinical social worker?
Gosh, I don't remember. You know, whenever after graduate school. Is that a couple of years? Yeah, I think.
Well, thank you very much again on behalf of USC
Well,
and
you're
the
welcome.
School of Social Work and the California Social Welfare Archives. So what we're doing is interviewing a number of prominent people in the city and having records of conversations. And we're sure grateful for your willingness to do this.
Well, you're welcome. It was interesting doing it.